Hello everybody and welcome to your semifinal match here at the StarCityGames.com Worcester Open, brought to you by Ultimate Guard. Ed Demicco is on Grixis Delver, was our 5th seed in the Swiss. He's playing against Rob Blocher, who is our 8th seed in the Swiss on Goblin Prison. And Rob is on a mulligan to 4, unfortunately.
You know, despite that, he does have a good hand. He has potential turn 1, Chalice for 1, and if it gets countered, a follow-up Chalice for 1, which would lock Ed Demicco out of most of his plays. A good 70% of his deck is just 1-mana cards.
So Ed is going to start off the game with a Gitaxian Probe falling to 18. We're going to see Mountain, Ancient Tomb, and 2 Chalice of the Void. He's going to play Volcanic Island and a Delver of Secrets. So Rob is very likely just going to play a Chalice for 1 here. Ed does have a Daze, so that's going to counter the Chalice.
But Rob is going to have the ability to just run this play back again on the following turn, and that I have to imagine is going to be the likely play. Chalice on 1 is one of the best things that you can do against these Grixis Delver decks.
Well, Ed is going to miss on his Delver flip. He's going to attack Rob for 1, put him down to 17.
And I have to imagine the most likely thing Ed wants to do is just play a cantrip and hopefully dig for another piece of permission. But it looks like instead he's just going to take the offensive.
He's going to play a Delver of Secrets. Let's see if Rob can get another Chalice going.
May also want to opt for the Blood Moon that he's drawn.
All right, well, Rob is going to fall down to 16. 7. Actually, he should be at 7 or 15.
So the advantage of playing the second Delver is it would just put Rob on a pretty fast 3-turn clock. Now this young Pyromancer is going to be able to get in over the Chalice, and even though Ed Demicco will have all of his 1-mana spells countered by this Chalice, they will still generate tokens from this young Pyromancer to get at least some value.
So even though Rob was able to put together some of his lock pieces for this Goblin Prison deck, he was on a mulligan to 4, his resources were pretty constricted, and Ed just had that one piece of permission that he needed to develop a board presence that kind of hinders all of these control elements that Rob has pretty invalid.
Yeah, that being said, Rob Blocher does have access to Umezawa's Jite in his deck, so things will be a little difficult for him, but he can find himself in a situation where he gets to a very low life total, but is able to stabilize. With these Delvers flipping, though, it's going to be quite difficult, and he's not going to have much time.
Yep. The Delvers have flipped. Ed is going to go ahead and play a Ponder. He's going to get an Elemental, but it will be countered by the Chalice of the Void. Ed is really just looking to get some 1/1 Elementals. He's going to turn his creature sideways.
And do we know what Rob got with the Imperial Recruiter?
Looks like he went and got Pia and Karen Nalar.
Okay, cool. Great card.
Unfortunately, he's just going to be taking too much damage.
Well, the Pia and Karen Nalar will, he can cast it and it'll put him down to 3. And the Pia can block one of the tokens, and then the 2 Thopters can block the Delvers. So technically, Rob can survive through this turn because of that Pia.
So Pia and Kieran Nalar is going to bring Rob down to 3. Going to pass the turn back to Ed. Just going to attack with everything. It's going to fall to 2. Now this is going to turn off that Ancient Tomb now. So it shuts off something like Kiki Jiki is being in and out. Magus of the Moon is not going to cut it, and Ed Demicco is going to take this first game very quickly over Rob Blocher. That mulligan to 4 didn't help, but Ed had all the answers that he needed and was able to develop a board presence before Rob could put some of those prison elements into place.
Yeah, and despite that mulligan to 4, if Rob had been on the play, we might have been looking at a different hand. He would have been able to play that Chalice on turn 1 before Ed Demicco would have been able to play the Delver or have access to the Daze that he cast. So even though Rob was down to a mulligan to 4, if he had just been on the play, he probably would have locked Ed Demicco out of the game before he could have developed any kind of board.
And we saw this, Rob lost the first game against Ben Friedman and then won two consecutive games after that. So let's take a look at the player sideboards and see what kind of changes and upgrades we might get. Ed Demicco has 4 Cabal Therapy, 1 Null Rod, 1 Pithy Needle, 1 Umezawa's Jite, 2 Pyroblast, 1 Ancient Grudge, 2 Surgical Extraction, 2 copies of Gurmag Angler, and a Fire Covenant. What do we think Ed is going to sideboard?
So I think there's a good chance that he brings in the Umezawa's Jite. He may also bring in the Null Rod or Pithing Needle as a way to deal with his opponent's Umezawa's Jite, although there can certainly be some friendly fire. Ancient Grudge is probably the better answer for the opposing Umezawa's Jite, and it also deals with the Chalices, the Trinispheres, all of that stuff. Gurmag Angler is also another nice big body that he may look to just to have a little bit more threat that's needed to make up for his lack of quality interaction.
Well, those all make perfect sense to me. Now on to Rob Blocher's side with his Goblin Prison deck. We have 4 copies of Leyline of the Void, 3 Ensnaring Bridge, 3 Fiery Confluence, 2 Sudden Shock, 1 Goblin Sharpshooter, 1 Tuk Tuk Scrapper, and 1 Phyrexian Revoker. What do you think Rob's going to bring in?
So I think Rob is probably going to be bringing in the Ensnaring Bridges, because if he empties his hand, his opponent is likely never going to be able to attack again. The Fiery Confluence is also another good card that he can bring. It's a card that can deal with all of the young Pyromancer tokens that can appear on the board, as can Goblin Sharpshooter.
Goblin Sharpshooter seems real sweet.
Yeah, it is a cool card for sure.
What do you think about potentially bringing in Sudden Shock as a way to kill Pyromancer and Delver without your opponent interacting?
He could do that. One nice thing about Sudden Shock also is that I believe it gets through Chalice of the Void on 2, which is pretty sweet because of the split second on it.
Well, split second stops people from playing abilities.
Oh, but the triggered
ability will still stop it. So unfortunately, it does still get countered. However, his opponent's not going to be able to do anything.
Yeah, he may bring in the Sudden Shock. I could see him not bringing it in because he wants to have access to as many prison pieces as possible, but it may be that some of his threats that are involved in winning the game, like his Goblin Rabble Masters, are unnecessary, and he has more room in his deck for sideboard cards.
Now, these players are in our top 4, and there's a lot at stake. Not only are we talking about, being able to say, I am the champion, if you're able to get onto the finals and win this event, but first place is $5,000, 30 SCG points. That is a lot of points, and an invite into an invitational. And once you get to that invitational, you have the chance to win $10,000, your own token, a spot in the Players' Championship. So making the top 8 here is your first step to try and get to that invitational. Runner-up is going to get $2,000, but a whopping 25 SCG points along with that invite. Top 4, $1,000 apiece and 20 points. So both of these players are already guaranteed $1,000 and 20 SCG points, and they're playing to increase their purse. That's got to be a little nerve-wracking if you're sitting down there battling to know that so much is on the line with this match.
Yeah, there really is a lot on the line, and the value of the points cannot be understated. We always talk about the Star City or the Players' Championship at the end of the year. We talk about qualifying for the invitationals, but there's also those buys that you get for having a lot of points. And we saw even this weekend, Gerard Fabiano, he barely missed top 8 on tiebreakers, and he picked up his first loss in round 1. A lot of the players that you'll see in the top 8, it's because they have those 2 buys to boost their tiebreakers, so that if it comes down to tiebreakers, they're going to be a little bit more advantaged. So these points really do pay in dividends, and they're so valuable. Even if you show up and only get 1, that 1 point is worth value.
Yep, there's a lot of value in playing in these open weekends, whether it's the actual open itself or the classics. Those points are worth so much more than face value.
Yeah, it really is the sort of, like, the points are what let you basically have a career.
So what do you think Rob needs to put together here in the first couple of turns, outside of not mulliganing to 4 and able to try and put this game away from Ed?
I think basically if he just hits his land drops and uses all of his mana every turn, he's going to be in very good shape, almost regardless of what he casts. All the cards in his deck are very problematic for this Delver deck, whether it's Chalice of the Void, Blood Moon, Trinisphere, or a Mogcatcher hitting play and starting to tutor up more problematic permanents. Rob just has to hit his land drops and use his mana, and he's going to be all set.
Now on Ed's side, what has to happen for Ed to have a chance here, being on the draw against this Goblin Prison deck?
So basically he needs things to go exactly how they did in game one, where he developed an offense, and then he was not able to interact with everything that Rob was doing, but he was able to interact with just enough so that he could keep attacking eventually for lethal damage. These Delver decks, they operate on such slim margins, and in these sort of matchups where they're not adequately prepared, they really rely on their speed and the quickness of their threats to make up for the fact that they're not actually prepared to answer everything that their opponent is doing.
All right. Well, Rob is going to lead off with a Cavern of Souls, naming human, and passing the turn to Ed Demicco. Now, Magus of the Moon, I believe, is a human.
Yep.
While Magus of the Moo might be a bovine.
Yeah.
Magus of the Moon is a human. So we might see the Magus of the Moon as early as next turn.
And Ed Demicco has access, or has had access to Rob's deck list. So he knows that there's 4 Magus of the Moons in the deck. He also knows that there's 2 Imperial Recruiters. There's also P and Girnalar, but there's not that many humans in the deck, and he's got to be thinking that Magus of the Moon is one of the upcoming plays.
So Ed Demicco is going to use the Gataxian Probe flying to 18. It's going to reveal Magus of the Moon, Simian Spirit Guide, Mog Catcher, Blood Moon, Murderous Redcap, and a Mountain. So we could be looking at a Magus of the Moon as early as next turn. However, Ed Demicco does have a copy of Lightning Bolt in his hand, which can make quick work of that Magus of the Moon.
He does, and there's a good chance that Ed Demicco will be forced to play with that Lightning Bolt mana available. The good thing, though, is Magus of the Moon hits play, he's definitely going to have access to red mana.
Right, Ed Demicco will draw a card for his Gataxian Probe. And he's going to start off with a Ponder.
Ooh, and it looks like Ed Demicco saw a Wasteland, which he is shuffling to the top to potentially draw next, which would be a great play against Rob's hand. Rob's hand is pretty light on mana. He just has a Mountain as his only other land drop, and his only other mana source is his Simian Spirit Guide, which is only going to be good for 1 use. So Ed Demicco could find a good opportunity to really poke a hole in Rob's draw by using a Wasteland on that Cavern of Souls.
It looks like Ed is going to decide to shuffle those cards away. Doesn't really want the Wasteland. Figures that's not really the fight that he wants to fight here.
So this may mean that Ed Demicco doesn't have pressure. He's not particularly well equipped to answer everything that Rob is doing, so he wants to develop a clock sooner rather than later.
All right, looks like Ed does find another Gataxian Probe off of that Ponder Shuffle. It's going to fall to 16. All right, and Rob is going to cast that Magus of the Moon. I think that this is a little risky considering that these Delver decks do have Lightning Bolts in them. But if Ed doesn't have one, this could be lights out.
Well, it'll certainly force a response from Ed Demicco one way or the other, so he's not going to be able to deploy something. Well, actually, I guess he would be able to play something like a Young Pyromancer this turn, but if he wants to fire off any cantrips, he's going to have to spend a mana dealing with that human now.
Oh, he's going to Lightning Bolt that Magus of the Moon. Something real important to note here is Ed Demicco has a Daze in his hand, but not a Force of Will. And Rob just picked up a Chalice of the Void, so he could have played Chalice and had Daze backup this turn rather than going for the Magus of the Moon. But I don't fault him for trying to lock out Ed Demicco's mana since he doesn't really have a lot
And he picked
going
up
on.
a Chrome Mox.
All right.
So this is going to allow him to play the Chalice and still have Daze backup.
There's a chance that he goes for this Blood Moon, though.
He could go for the Blood Moon, although I feel like that's slightly less likely considering that Deathrite Shaman is in play.
All right, he's going to imprint Mog Catcher onto the Chrome Mox.
I really like going for the Chalice because it's so unlikely that Ed Demicco is going to be able to deal with it once it hits play.
All right, so Chalice for 1 is going to resolve for Rob Blocher.
And this is going to limit a lot of Ed's plays. Ed's basically looking at a potential Gurmag Angler. He can still cast his Daze or Fire Ice and Young Pyromancer, but and there's Force of Will, but basically everything else is going to get countered by this Chalice on 1. Ed Demicco really needs to find his Ancient Grudge.
We have a Young Pyromancer, which is going to be able to make use of those spells, even if they do get countered. For Ed Demicco, he has a copy of Scalding Tarn. He's going to pass the turn back to Rob Blocher.
And like we saw in the previous game, Ed Demicco, if he casts any 1-mana spells, they will be countered, but he will be able to cash them in for a token for the Young Pyromancer to get some use out of it.
Now Rob is going to go with his red cap here and walk it into the Daze. He could have played that Blood Moon and played around a potential Daze and red capped later, but it is going to get countered here.
The nice thing is that Rob is still at 20 life, so he's got a little bit of time. Granted, his life total is going to come under duress on Ed's combat step, but after having played around the Daze of 1 turn, I frequently like continuing to do so.
I agree. Ed is going to use his Scalding Tarn here on Rob's end step. Maybe we see something like Fiery Confluence here, sweeping up this board.
Yeah, I certainly think that that is one of the things that Rob is hoping to draw to. If I were him, I would probably try to develop a little bit more of a lock on Ed's resources. I would if I had the option to cast Fiery Confluence and Blood Moon, and I had both in my hand, I would probably cast the Blood Moon first.
All right, well, Ed is going to eat a probe out of his own graveyard, get in 2 points of damage, or 2 life loss to Rob. It's going to bring him down to 18. Oh, Ed did find a Wasteland, and that's going to hit that Cavern of Souls. Ed is going to attack for 3 with his Young Pyromancer and the Elemental token and pass the turn back to Rob. There's a Goblin Rabblemaster.
Goblin Rabblemaster would certainly be able to race what Ed Demicco has, but it could be a little vulnerable to removal.
Well, here is a Blood Moon for Rob. Ed is going to float a mana and then Daze.
And things, you know, hindsight is 20/20. It certainly would have worked out better for Rob to have played the Blood Moon on the previous turn. He'd still have his land. He'd render these Dazes useless, but things are just not lining up in a way that's favorable for him.
And Ed is going to make a couple more elemental tokens with a Brainstorm that gets countered by Chalice of the Void, and then do 2 more points of damage to Rob with that Deathred Shaman. He is just working this clock and fighting around all of the restrictions that Rob is putting on his resources just fine. Young Pyromancer is a great card.
Yeah, Young Pyromancer is really good. That said, Rob could just find a land and a Fiery Confluence and clean up this board.
All right. This attack for 5 is going to bring Rob down to 8. Rob is going to play a Goblin Rabblemaster, though. A Goblin token's going to attack. Ed is going to block it with the 1/2 Deathrite Shaman.
And this 2 toughness on Deathrite Shaman, always being relevant, is going to allow it to block this Rabblemaster token for free.
Ed is going to Brainstorm on Rob's end step, have it get countered by the Chalice of the Void, but it will generate another elemental.
And I think with a Fire and Ice, Ed Demicco is going to have a win here. He can tap the Rabblemaster and I believe deal 2 damage to Rob and then attack with everything for the win. And that is going to be the match. Ed Demicco wins a bad match against Rob Blocher, who's come in with this amazing Goblin Prison deck, something that we haven't seen in, I can't imagine when the last time we saw it in the top 8 was. But Ed Demicco is going to take it with some really tight play. He's been able to be the aggressor despite facing some serious prison elements, but he's been able to push through, and now he's going to be on to the finals.
Oh.